Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you here. Just a couple of housekeeping things. We are offering interpretation, French interpretation, and you should be able to join the French channel by clicking on one of the Zoom buttons. It looks like a circle with a globe in it, says interpretation, and let us know if you have any issues getting on there. But otherwise, let's just jump right into it and get started. I'll be doing a quick opening and an introduction of our speakers, and then we'll be able to hear all of the amazing things that they're going to say. My name is Saromro. I'll be moderating today, and I'm just so excited to listen and also learn from just the brilliance that's about to unfold as our three speakers bring us with them on their reflections of the migrant justice struggle for the past 20 years. I'm an organizer at the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change. We are a workers' rights organization with a membership of migrants in farm work, domestic care and healthcare work, and low-wage work, and which includes migrant workers, current and former international students, refugees, and undocumented people. We also serve as the secretariat of the largest cross-country migrant-led coalition in Canada called the Migrant Rights Network, who is hosting this event. I live in Toronto on the lands that is the territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. This land is held together by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, which is a binding and also a promise to share and protect the land together. We all know that COVID-19's exposed and worsened just the fundamental injustices in our society. And we entered the pandemic shortly after Indigenous land defenders and water protectors from Wet'suwet'en Nation powerfully raised the call to shut down Canada. And as both the pandemic and the crisis caused by capitalism rages on, Indigenous people are still fighting the forces of this illegal and extractive settler colonial state. I'm a migrant from the Korean Peninsula, and given the US military's occupation of our lands and the greater Asia Pacific theater, the struggle for peace, freedom, and self-determination in my homeland is intertwined with the liberation of Indigenous nations in Canada and North America. Under the duress of empire and the interests of the ruling class there, South Korean corporations have invested in the very coastal gas link pipeline that's being violently encroaching into Wet'suwet'en. So as migrants, it's important for us to remember our responsibility as well and know that our movements and our struggles for justice are fundamentally linked. I've been involved in the migrant justice movement in Canada for almost a decade, and to this day, I'm still fighting for my rights with my brothers, sisters, siblings, comrades who are undocumented, who are farm workers, care workers, students, refugees, and also with the ones who've passed, but we still carry on with us. So today, I am so excited to sit with these, giant movement leaders who have been doing this work for a decade more to reflect on how far we've come and where we need to go. Just want to emphasize that today's event is at a crucial juncture. Because of decades of organizing, regularization, the concept of regularization is on the agenda. Right now, the government of Canada is planning to give permanent rights to undocumented people. But we don't know how many and who. But what we do have is the power to make sure that it's all of us, every single one of us, with no one left behind. And that's why this weekend, thousands of migrants and allies across the country will take to the streets. Right now, we need to show Prime Minister Trudeau that there is mass support for regularization and status for all, that there is mass support for ensuring equal rights for 1.7 million people. That's 1 in 23 people in Canada. We are your neighbors, your coworkers, your friends, your classmates in your communities, and it's all of us. we need to show that there is support and that this is something that we will continue to fight for, that we will not back down until every single one of us is included. I'm going to drop a link in the chat, and I'm just going to wait. If can you all take 1 minute right now to let us know you're joining the action on the 18th. It's just this Sunday. And after you signed up, share with others, share on your social networks. And if there isn't an action near you, you can sign the petition and text 3 people you know to get them to sign too. So I'll just drop that in the chat. Also, I'm going to be asking questions to our 3 speakers, so please only use the Q&A function if you have questions, and we'll see if there is time, but we'll just kind of take it from here. Okay, so now if you're here, you know who they are, and they're going to talk about themselves as well. Today we have 3 organizers, women, migrant leaders, who are joining us today: ROBYN MAYNARD, HARSHA WALIA, and NAZILA BETTACHE. ROBYN MAYNARD is a Toronto-based writer and scholar. Her latest book is Rehearsals for Living, co-authored with Leanne Betasamosake Simpson. HARSHA WALIA is a South Asian activist and writer based in Vancouver on unceded Coast Salish Territories, and her latest book is Border and Rule. And of course, NAZILA BETTACHE is a Montreal-based social justice activist, physician, and a member of Caring for Social Justice Collective. Okay, so let's get started. So everyone, probably many people who are here don't know that you all started organizing in migrant justice movements in Montreal and have been connected to this work for 20 years. Can you tell us what migrant justice means to you, and how it's shaped your thinking and actions today? Maybe we can start with Harsha.
Thank you. Can I just take a moment to say thank you all for organizing, for all the amazing collective work that goes into the struggle. I know we were introduced with much love and fanfare about being movement leaders, but really we know there's so many in this space that collectively are movement leaders and that we've built this movement together, past, present, and the future. So let me just emphasize our collective organizing in the struggle, and how vital it is to have so many of our comrades here alongside, and to be in conversation with beloved NAZILA and ROBYN, who are just such brilliant, fierce revolutionaries. I'm on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. And I offer that not as a land acknowledgement, but in deep recognition that Indigenous laws and jurisdiction are alive on these lands. And so when we say no one is illegal, Canada is illegal, that's not a slogan. That is something that this movement has brought about in terms of a critical anti-colonial analysis of what it means to center Indigenous sovereignty in the context of migrant justice struggles. What does it mean to align ourselves with anti-colonial struggles rather than the settler colonial state? And I think, that is one of, you asked in terms of what migrant justice means to you, that is primarily one of the foremost lessons, I think, of the radical migrant justice movement, which is to shift away from the kind of mainstream immigrant rights framework to aligning with a global anti-colonial, anti-capitalist movement. And as you introduced, right, these global interconnections of empire that aren't just about immigrants in this domesticated kind of context, but migration as a global phenomenon. And, we're in the midst of this totally wild moment of being told that the right thing to do is to mourn for the colonizer queen. And this is a moment where we remember that we're in a colonial present, right? That we're in a colonial present, that so many people who have been colonized in different ways around the world are bound up in so many systems of colonization and are bound up in border violences in different ways. And in terms of, what migrant justice means to me, I alluded to this earlier, but really about collective organizing. And I just do want to emphasize just how many victories and how many losses and how many people have been involved in the struggle, and self-organized communities of migrants and refugees who have led the struggle. I'm going to just say some names because I really want to invoke their presence and, you know, their legacy over decades. And there are so many more, but the Barasas family, Kader, the Ayub family, Mohammed Sharfi, Manen Ayel, the Vega family, Ali Raza Monami, Amir Kazemian, Lambar Singh, Cobra Natki, Osama Saleh, Shamim Akhtar and her family, Adrian Dragon, Wendy Maxwell, Carla Lotini, Kimberly and Gerald Lozano Sosa, Muhammad Harkat, Adil Sharkawi, Muhammad Mahjoub, Mahmoud Jaballa, Hassan Al-Murray, Danny Villanueva, Gabriela Dua, the Chaudhry family, Alvaro Orozco, Lucia Vega Jimenez, Diana Hernandez, Sheldon McKinsey, and so many more. You know, these are folks who have built this movement, against deportation, against detention, for status for all, against migrant worker exploitation, and have borne a lot of violence in this fight. I also, from my end, want to dedicate my conversation to 4 comrades whom we've lost in the struggle during the pandemic. One is Waldo, who was a founder of Known as Legal Vancouver, a former Chilean political prisoner. And we're, you know, on the tail ends of September 11th. He was one of the comrades who fought the US dictatorship and the US installed coup against Allende. And he was pivotal in the migrant justice movement for decades. Kat Norris, who is the founder of Indigenous Action Movement, a Coast Salish woman and a leader and a matriarch who aligned Indigenous struggles from her perspective with migrant justice struggles. Faria Chaudhry from Toronto, who is such a key leader in our movements and brought so much love and light and brilliance to these movements. And Aziz Chaudhry, who's a movement scholar who documented particularly the struggles of migrant workers from below. So what migrant justice means to me is all of these folks, all of this struggle that we have created together. And I think it's, you know, fundamentally the idea of the freedom to move and the freedom to stay, which is the idea that, again, we're bound up in global violences and we fight for the freedom to move and the freedom to stay, right? That this is a fight against global displacement, why people move, how their movement is constrained. And again, as I mentioned, it's not about assimilation into racial capitalism or racial citizenship or proving gratitude or proving innocence. Like, all of that is not something that the radical migrant justice movement is about. In fact, it has been about pushing against this, often in our own communities, often against mainstream immigrant rights organizations, definitely against the settlers, the settlement services, often against our comrades in the union movement, who for a very long time did not support migrant worker struggles. And so, you know, that is, to me, what the migrant justice movement has been about fundamentally trying to insert an anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, abolitionist politics into how we understand the struggle fundamentally against the settler state and for people's right to move and to be free.
Thank you, Harsha. Those are kind of such important touch points. Let me bring NAZILA in. NAZILA, what about you? What do you think about that? And also, what are the lessons that migrant justice has given you that you carry on in your work?
Thanks, Saram. Thanks, Harsha, for those really powerful words. I also want to start by thanking everyone who's organizing the event tonight, and also everybody doing translation. I know it's hard work, and also everybody who's organizing for Status for All on September 18th. I want to honor the work of everybody tonight. Thank you for the intros. I also feel a bit like an imposter on the panel tonight. You know, any piece of analysis or reflection of thoughts that I might share with you all tonight are obviously not mine. They're, you know, the consequence of many, many conversations and people who've challenged me and taught me over the years, including people who are on the panel tonight and people who are in the audience tonight. So I want to thank everybody. I actually did a little exercise and asked some of my friends and comrades if they had things to share, and I'm going to try to do justice to some of their profound reflections and insights. I'm calling in from occupied Kanien'kehá:ka territory here in Tiohtià:ke, the Kanien'kehá:ka people who continue to exercise their jurisdiction and sovereignty on this territory. And as Harsha said, I think it's fundamental to migrant justice work and migrant justice movement and no borders politics to ground our analysis and our work in supporting Indigenous sovereignty and recognizing Indigenous jurisdiction. It's a key fundamental piece, and I'm sure we'll come back to it. I also, thanks Harsha for doing that. I also wanted to, and this is Fred Burrell, who I think might be on the call tonight, one of our friends and comrades from Solidarity Across Borders, who when I asked him what he thought about what to bring to the conversation tonight, mentioned this, and I think it's true, is that the fact that we're having this conversation, the fact that we're sitting around this virtual table discussing regularization tonight is a victory in and of itself. And I think it's worth celebrating and honoring the work of people who've dedicated, so much time and energy over the last decades, but also to remember all our friends who we weren't able to stop their deportations over the years, and to remember people who've lost their lives in the struggle, who were essentially killed by borders and immigration. So what does migrant justice mean to me? I mean, we could go on for a while, but I want to pick up on what Harsha was mentioning in terms of the importance of recognizing what she actually describes really well in her book around border regimes and border thinking and the interconnectedness of various social structures that operate and create oppression, right? So the vision and analysis of migrant justice allows us to really understand that, the capital that gentrifies your neighborhood is the same that's connected to extractive industries that are displacing migrants. It's connected to the military industrial complex and border control that's connected to, the hyper exploitation of migrant workers and temp workers and domestic workers, to the carceral system that, a lot of sort of social systems of control are connected to, and to obviously the major climate crisis that we're all living through right now. And this is not new. We know that it's in continuity with, going back to colonization, to the transatlantic slave trade, but this concept of, interconnectedness is fundamental to how we understand and build our analysis, but also, I think, fundamental to how we build our movements, right? So connecting various movements fighting around these issues in a way that's genuine and meaningful. And I'll just use two examples that speak to me in terms of my recent experience in the last few years in organizing here in Montreal. One of them, I think, is prison abolition, and I'd be really interested to hear what Harsha and ROBYN have to say about this, but how the analysis and the work around prison abolition and police abolition has evolved over the last few years. We've seen connections happen, over the years in different campaigns, whether they were, fighting for justice for people who were killed by the police here in Montreal, whether we think of Mohamed Anas Benes or Kilem Registre, or Harsha mentioned Freddie Villanueva, Bridget Tolley. So all these campaigns over the years that have built momentum, connected also most recently to, in the context of the pandemic, migrant detainees who went on hunger strike, and the connections there being made with, again, border regimes and border control and policing and surveillance. And even beyond that, and this is dear friend and comrade Helen Hudson, who shared this with me, is understanding that, and this is often something that's done, is it's not just immigration detention that's akin to the prison system, but it's the border itself, right? It's the bordering, again, thinking and regime, the fact that both borders and prisons separate communities, close contact between people, over generations, create precarity, prevent people from building community, keep them in or keep them out. And so this idea that they're both sort of technologies of enclosure is something that is really, I think, deepening in our analysis and in our work. And I think that's really, really important to continue to do and continue to develop. The other one that's also close to the kind of work I've been doing more health justice organizing over the last few years with the Caring for Social Justice Collective. And it's been really inspiring to see the evolution again of the work and the analysis from, sort of more, as Harsha was saying, benevolence or charity-based organizing around, for example, in 2012, the mobilizing around the cuts to the IFHP program, the Interim Federal Health Program, so don't cut healthcare for refugees, to more recently through the amazing work that Health for All Toronto has been doing over the years, and more recently the work that we've been involved with Healthcare for All in Quebec, with the idea of, again, no borders in healthcare. So thinking of border regimes within healthcare and the analysis of policing and surveillance within public services, and denouncing immigration policies as murderous. So not just appealing to sort of this benevolence of, please provide healthcare to refugees, but also focusing on, the violence of immigration within healthcare and of borders within healthcare. So I'll stop here for the sake of time, but I'm curious to hear what others think.
Thank you, NAZILA, and for also kind of, painting that picture of how the migrant justice movement is a groundswell for all these important intersections. Let's turn to ROBYN. Welcome. Tell us, where did you enter the migrant justice story, so to speak, and what are the lessons that it's given you?
Sure, thank you so much. It's so great to be here. I just want to say first, with these two brilliant women who I'm sharing the panel with, thank you so much for hosting. And also, I just want to express so much gratitude to the Migrant Rights Network, and also, to Solidarity Across Borders, and the leadership of undocumented folks all around Turtle Island, who have done such a huge amount of the legwork to get us here to where we are today, where we're in a position where we can talk in a serious way about the project and possibility of regularization. So I just want to highlight how much collective labor has gone into that. And, I was so honored to be asked to speak at this event. But I think, like my other speakers, just want to so much remind everybody here that, I'm happy to have been a very small part of these broader constellations of collective movements, of collective knowledge production, of hardworking people, who've been constantly making enormous sacrifices, particularly people who've been coming up really against, the brutal edges of detention, of deportation, of surveillance, of things like security certificates and more broadly. So, yeah, thinking about, it's been really interesting to go back and start thinking about some of this historically. And there's so many photos that I found from, across the years that I won't share today, but I was just remembering when, thinking about this question that you'd sent over about the earliest memory that I have is, I think that I was 18, and for some reason, we were at some event in Ottawa. I was not yet part of the movement. I remember I was this 18-year-old sort of baby radical. I was holding a copy of Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. And I remember, meeting some of the people who eventually would go on to become lifetime comrades and friends and people who I'd respect. So many of you who've known me for longer periods would know that at that time I was probably wearing like my uniform of my hand-length miniskirt, which was the uniform of, the first the first decade of the 2000s. And that's really something, being involved in No One Is Illegal, being involved in migrant justice struggle is part of the way that I came into adulthood, living in Montreal, hosting No One Is Illegal radio, doing political education, and of course, broader work and movement work around policing, racial profiling by enforced sex workers struggles. So it's really incredible to see actually how much has happened for when, as organizers, we would be ridiculed for saying the idea that there could be something like status for all, right? Whereas now it's something that's considered policy. So I just want to say, again, that there's so much labor that goes unseen once things become normalized, that I think it's so helpful to actually, create these kinds of different historical memories. So what migrant justice means to me, I don't want to recreate. I think that HARSHA and NAZILA have put together such a beautiful analytic framework that links displacement, Indigenous sovereignty, the relationship between so many other kinds of organizing labor for exploitation, right? But I would say instead, just maybe to add to this and to highlight what NAZILA brought forward, is that to me, migrant justice at its most radical, which is I think how we necessarily need to think about it, is always part of a broader abolitionist politic, right? A movement against borders and detention and racializing surveillance in that sense also is necessarily a movement against police and policing and against the criminalization of things like drugs, sex work, poverty, because of course we're not only moving towards the criminalization of human movement, but the criminalization of human beings more broadly, right? That this is always part of a broader struggle to build a world without cages, without surveillance, without controls over people's mobility, whether that's within and across national borders or within the cityscape, where we know that things like driving while Black or walking through a park or playing the dice in a park like Freddie Villanueva was, for example, when he was shot and killed by SPVM officer Jean-Louis Lapointe, that these are movements against capitalism and imperialisms of all kinds. So I think that that's something that this particular movement has been able to articulate really well, I think in many ways because of the grassroots nature of the ways that some of these movements started out, the unfunded, unrelated to significant, philanthropy or anything. What it really did allow for was a kind of really strong radical movement in the, what I would say is sort of the last I would think I've been involved for 17 or 18 years, but that I have seen, right? So as opposed to 20. But I think that's something that's made these sort of very radical demands be able to sort of be at the floor of the way that we think about that organizing. The only thing I would want to add, because so much, I think, really beautiful thinking has happened already here, is that to me, thinking about migrant justice is also necessarily a Black liberation issue in ways that are really important, particularly, in this post-2020 moment when we've seen a massive uprising, in defense of Black life, against policing, against prisons. And I think that, to me, again, borders is necessarily a part of that. So if the first controls, the first really major globalized controls over human movement were enslavement, we have such a long history of Black folks in particular fighting for mobility, fighting against, immobilities of all kind. And there are so many kind of historical linkages that help ground even the last 20 years of this movement, right? So if we look to the Black people who are crisscrossing the border trying to escape slavery, if we look to the ways that Black domestic workers, when the domestic worker program was created, Black women organized against deportations that they were facing. So I just really wanted to, the ways that also Black folks who'd come from Oklahoma facing lynching, right, were then facing immigration racism in Canada and really fighting against that. So I just think that these are particular kinds of histories that I also like to remember in terms of the before and in terms of the kinds of genealogies as well. Living in a context, that's just sort of my entry point for this as a Black feminist, right? And in terms of where in Canada's population, as many of us know, more than half of Black people were not born here, right? So being subject to intensive policing, which is part of being Black in this country, necessarily means that the harm of borders is a part of what it means to be Black here. And I'm just saying this because I think it's something that's really crucial to remember. And it doesn't always help when we import sort of the US Black Lives Matter frame, because I think that's something that's really actually important to what Black struggle is here. So these are some things, that we always, through known as legal radio, had tried to bring in, many years ago, doing interviews with Black anarchists in the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army, with organizing around Uri Jallo, who's a migrant from Sierra Leone who'd been burned alive in a police cell in Germany, right? That these are part of these global movements too, that I think can help us think about freedom differently, right? So that migrant struggle, I think, Harsha, you did such a great job of positioning it as really different than, the classic immigrant rights struggle, in that the vision and the terrain of struggle is so expansive because of that. So that's the last thing I'll say for now. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing more from everybody.
Absolutely, so incredibly expansive. And Robyn, we're going to need to see these photos as well. But let's kind of just stay and stick with these early days for a little bit. NAZILA, just kind of can you paint it out for us? What was happening back in, 2001? I mean, we just marked the 21st anniversary. Can you speak to the early days, the post 9/11 period, and some of the earliest calls for regularization, and what in the last 20 years do you want us to remember about it?
Oof. Okay, big mission. Harsha and I were joking that she was Auntie Harsha, and that I would defer to her for earlier memories, because I only really started organizing in the mid-2000s, but I'll start, and feel free, both of you, to elaborate. Before saying anything, I really want to thank whoever came up with the idea of doing this timeline, because without falling into sort of romantic nostalgia, I think it was a really interesting exercise to really be forced to reckon with, a sequence of events that happened over the last few years, but really looking at it as sort of a genealogy, or like an origin story. We know that it doesn't happen in a vacuum, obviously, that, it's kind of like quantum physics in a way, like any discussion of a specific period of time has to be rooted in whatever came before. And so while I can't speak to, all the various movements in Montreal that were happening in the 90s, whether it's, Chilean migrants, struggling for status, sanctuary movement, anti-globalization movement from, again, that period of time, centering Indigenous sovereignty around the siege of Ganastage, or the so-called Oka crisis, Palestine solidarity during the Second Intifada. All these things, I think, were sort of the kind of ground where the groundswell then happened of the period of time that we're talking about. And I think it's important to say that, but because I think as organizers, as people who try to study our movements, we need to sort of look at this continuity and look at how specific contexts have informed our struggles, our movements, and the outcomes of our movements. And so, for example, and this is, again, dear friend and comrade and partner, Samir Shaheen Hussain, who was sharing this when we were talking about, lessons, I guess, from the last 20 years, how, for example, the campaign for, Harsha mentioned Abdelkader Balaouni, who was an Algerian non-status migrant who took sanctuary in Montreal in 2005, and several of us were involved in that campaign and supporting him. That church where he took sanctuary was in Pointe Saint Charles, which is a neighborhood in Montreal, for those who don't know, who has deep, deep roots in organizing, anti-poverty organizing, housing, dating back decades. And so I think the fact that he took sanctuary in that neighborhood and there was that history and those movements allowed for a particular kind of relationship and a particular kind of movement to grow. And I still remember, and others on this call probably do, the times where there were scares that, CBSA was coming to the church, and like within minutes, like dozens of people would be mobilized from the neighborhood and would come to the church and defend Kader and sanctuary. So I think those kinds of roots and those kinds of origins and genealogies are super important. The three things, again, for the sake of time, I want to highlight just a few things, and I'm really curious to hear what others have to say about that time period. But I think in reflecting and again, talking to several comrades about this, some of the lessons that came out of that period were around the kind of strength and power of self-organized migrant communities that were, and I can only really speak to the Algerian non-status committee. I was not really involved with the others, but the idea that, a community, a strong and sizable community, was self-organizing for status for all and did win regularization, but did so also on a principle, which is, I think, super important to reiterate tonight, which is that of status for all, right? That of no one left behind, no exceptions, no exclusions, everyone gets status. And that's something that they fought for until the end, even when the deal came in, excluding several people who were criminalized or people who were targeted because they were perceived as leaders of the movement. And so continued to the end and resisted this division of, deserving, undeserving, good immigrant, bad immigrant, and really rooted that struggle in solidarity. And I think that's something that we need to continue to anchor our movements in and to remember from that time. So again, regularization for all, no exceptions, no discrimination, no one left behind. I think that's one of the lessons that came out of that movement, and there's many more. The other thing that I think is interesting to reflect on, I guess, more from an analytical point of view, is the specific dynamics of being in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 and the war on terror and its various ramifications, both domestically and internationally, in terms of treatment of migrants, security certificates. Harsha mentioned some of those earlier. And so the sort of triad of discourse around national security, public security, and national identity being very reminiscent to what we're living through now with the rise of the far right, with the intense stigmatization and othering of migrants and targeting and scapegoating. In the Quebec context where I'm rooted, the current language around national identity, Bill 21, Bill 96, which themselves are obviously continuities of the previous reasonable accommodation debates and the charter values and all that is obviously the sort of historical context that is important and is informing the current context. Also the crime scares, the sort of context of the current political campaign, we're going into elections very soon, bringing back this sort of very intense anti-migrant and xenophobic sentiment. And so we need to be really aware of that, and we need to be particularly aware of that, I think, in the context of the aftermath of the pandemic and the sort of widening disparities, which we know the right will exploit, increasing inequalities and real material concerns around jobs, around food, around housing, to stigmatize migrants and to recruit for to sort of build up the far right. And at the same time, and we've been here before, governments who basically will use the specter of the far right to essentially adopt wholesale adoption of the policies. And that's exactly what's unfolding right now in Quebec. And we need to be really, really, I think, aware of that in our analysis and in our strategies and tactics. And also the fact that, and I hesitate to open this can of worms because it's a deeper conversation, but the fact that when co-optation fails, repression usually takes over. And so thinking back to the non-status Algerians, the caste committee that I was mentioning earlier, and the fact that, you know, when some of the excluded members decided to do an occupation of Coder's office in Ottawa, I don't know if people remember that, they were brutally arrested and criminalized. And the punishment really that the state exacted in this kind of brutal repression and targeting, years of trial and precarity. And this is a conversation with, again, long-term friend and comrade Andrea Schmidt, who was sharing, who was part of that group of people who were arrested, that it was really, you know, intentionally cruel and meant to punish them and demobilize the movement and sort of send a message for future movement. So, and this is something that we can talk about, you know, if we talk about the G20 or other things that might come up in the timeline tonight, but I think it's something that we need to be ready for and be very conscious of. And then the last thing that I'll mention is just the importance of continuing to build both our analysis and our understanding of sort of the inner workings of the machine, the immigration machine. I think a lot of people, you know, on the ground doing grassroots work, were able to learn and better understand through doing direct action casework, for example, and, you know, building agencies and doing pros and just kind of understanding the inner workings of the machine. Also understanding, you know, the difference, for example, with how the system will use different strategies to target people, right? Like in the early 2000s, there was a campaign in Montreal in support of two Basque activist political prisoners, Eduardo and Gorka, who were extradited to Spain. And then several years later, a few of us were involved in supporting another Basque political prisoner, Iban Palaza Sancho, who was deported to Spain. So how like different tools can be used at different moments in order to, you know, target people and enact more repression. And this is again in continuity with prior waves of repression against Black communities, against Indigenous communities. So just to, again, be very conscious and study these movements and understand what lessons and legacies we carry with us today. Again, I'll stop here. Really curious to hear what others have to say about that time.
These are all just extremely crucial lessons about regularization that we need to learn from right now. I took so many notes, NAZILA. I think what you're saying, it kind of tells us that this is not going to be an easy fight, right? ROBYN really highlighted this earlier about how this immigration system criminalizes us, punishes us for doing things like speaking up about unfair working conditions or leaving exploitative jobs, deferring school courses, or being unable to pay for tuition, or even, you know, just walking down the street. And so those are just important lessons. This is not going to be easy, right? We might not win everything at once, but no matter what, we have to continue. And what matters right now is the kind of power we have to build so that we can continue and keep going until we win PR for all of us, win justice for all of us, and the world that we want to live in. And so that was just such important reminders. Picking up where NAZILA brought us, Harsha, can you talk about some of what happened in the you know, the so-called Harper era and how that's different from now? You know, and specifically, how did things like the refugee crisis or the 2008 recession and so on shape what took place and the kind of movements that emerged from it?
Thanks for that. The Harper years. Yeah, I think I'm going to backtrack a little bit to some of the earlier years too and pick up on some stuff NAZILA said and fast forward to the Harper years. Only because I think the Harper years are a little bit more obvious, for lack of a better word. Everyone hated Harper. You know, we can kind of summarize that fairly quickly. But I do want to emphasize a few things, because I think the earlier periods, for lack of a better word, you know, where time starts, where it ends, but the time frame that we're talking about is very relevant, particularly around the status for all battle and the battle for regularization. And just to emphasize that, you know, what seems mainstream now, like status for all as a policy demand, has been an ongoing battle. And the idea that this is now seemingly common sense really wasn't. There was a lot of fights over decades around, you know, the principles for regularization. And what the idea was around principles for regularization was this basic idea of like, how do we take what we believe, which is no human is illegal and borders should be abolished, and make it into a policy platform, right? Like, how do we develop non-reformist reforms from what is essentially a radical idea, which is that, we're like, no borders, no banks, no bosses, no bombs, like, all of the things that we didn't want. And how do we distill that into a policy platform that we know we're not going to necessarily win, but that is what we envision. And, two of the biggest battles around the principles for regularization, there was many, but in my view, two of the biggest ones, and I'm sure ROBYN will touch on one of these in more depth, was the 13th principle, which was the idea that status for all shouldn't be a bludgeon for double punishment, which is that people who may be criminalized through all the different systems that criminalize people, the most obvious of which is police and prisons, but there are many criminalizing systems that of course disproportionately impact Black and Indigenous people, who are then double, triple criminalized, right? In terms of racial profiling and surveillance, what may result in the criminalization through the police and prison system, and then deportation, that pipeline was something that we rejected, right? That status for all meant that people who may have criminal records, quote unquote, within the context of the Canadian settler state should not be excluded from regularization. And here I point to a current struggle, the Keep Aisha Home struggle, which is so critical in fighting double, triple punishment as well. That was a huge battle. And the other one was the idea that everyone should have status, that it really shouldn't be contingent on anything, like shouldn't depend on whether you have, if you're a worker in a particular sector, it shouldn't depend on your length of residency, that it really was status upon arrival. And that was a big battle because most organizations and even unions and just the sector at large were willing to get on board with regularization, but only in very clearly defined situations, right? Like workers in a particular sector, the construction sector, or in the case of the non-status Algerians, the sans statut, that struggle, there was a number of exceptions within that. And that struggle was really important, as NAZILA highlighted, because the non-status Algerians fought to ensure no one was excluded. And I want to emphasize how important that is, because this is people who were, quote unquote, benefiting, right? People who had been through so much, who were benefiting from this program. And there was such collective organizing and consciousness raising and solidarity built that it made it impossible, or made it harder for the state to divide and conquer, because that is what the state will do, right? It will take people's desperation and precarity and use that to divide people. And that action that NAZILA talked about that happened in May 2003, when 10 members of the Action Committee for Non-Status Algerians, did that occupation. They were brutally tasered, went through court until 2006, when they were finally acquitted. 2 non-status Algerians were deported in the meantime, but the fact that they kept fighting, right? People could have easily said, actually, I'm not excluded. I'm one of the ones who's included within this program, and I'm just going to take this, right? That they didn't is the very foundation that we stand on. That people ensured that no one was left behind, that they put that into practice and struggle. And there was immense criminalization, immense targeting for that. When Mohammed Sharifi went into sanctuary, his sanctuary was violated. He was deported to the US. There was a fight to bring him back. That is, that's the struggle and the spirit of struggle that I want to, for us to think about in this moment, where there's another moment, right? When the state may ostensibly grant regularization, that we ensure that we keep the fight going to make sure that no one is left behind. The other kind of piece that takes us also into the Harper years, it's kind of not unique to any moment that I want to emphasize that NAZILA was touching on, which is direct action casework, right? Which is that we don't, of course, when we're fighting for status, that involves interfacing with immigration and the immigration system. That's true for most struggles. We can't avoid that these systems regulate our lives, but that we do it in a way where we are empowering ourselves and our communities into that fight. And, direct action casework was this idea that we take the fight to the institutions that are repressing and criminalizing us. And, a model borrowed from OCAP and Drum in the United States and many others. And, that involved people literally occupying offices, going to immigration offices, storming immigration offices, and fighting for status for individual people, fighting individual detention and deportation, or collective ones. And through that direct action casework, as NAZILA mentioned, you learn a lot, right? Like you literally become lawyers. Very few people in the struggle are trained lawyers, almost none, but you learn, and you very quickly learn the links to so many other criminalizing systems that NAZILA and ROBYN were talking about earlier, right? The links to child apprehension, people's kids being taken away, What's happening about being denied access to schools? You know, the Lozano family who were picked up in schools, you know, hospital access and people being reported to detention and deportation by people working in hospitals, policing and double punishment, you know, all of those links, if they aren't already obvious, become obvious when you're fighting in the struggle, because you start to see that immigration is a central node, but there are so many other pieces that people are fighting. Of course, labor exploitation is so crucial to that, right? So you start to see how immigration is one piece of the way in which criminalization works. And that is crucial, because a fight for status for all, you know, the lesson we learn is that it doesn't end when people gain status, because the criminalization that, you know, that will compound in other ways doesn't necessarily end. So it does in fact mean that even after we win status for all, we not only have to fight for status for all people, we have to then ensure dignity and safety for all people, irrespective of their status, right? That, you know, the kind of exploitations that are happening in schools and hospitals with social workers, on the workforce, you know, on the shop floor, all of those have to end as well. And, you know, this is especially crucial in the Harper era, because we know one of the main things that the Harper era did was basically cut all forms of permanent residency. And we've, you know, inherited the system of temporary migration now. That was, you know, predated the Harper era, but really became entrenched under Jason Kenney, who was, you know, immigration minister under Stephen Harper. You know, so really thinking about the ways in which immigration is criminalized, not only through detention and deportation, but also through precarious work and temporary work, and how central that is to how immigration functions in Canada today. And the lessons of that era were that, you know, we fight for status upon arrival. We fight for all people to have landed status upon arrival, that it's not a pathway to citizenship, which is what this government likes to propose, but that it's actually status upon arrival, open work permits. The Harper era was also an era of, you know, the G20, the Olympics. I think that was the Harper era. I don't actually know when governments came into power, the exact years. I think it was. You know, so a lot of cross movement organizing was so critical. And I think, you know, one of the things that migrant justice movements really brought to the forefront in these broader movements against the G20 and the Olympics was a radical migrant justice, anti-racist analysis to what this means, you know, so to the G20, that we're not just fighting something over there that the G20 does, that the war is at home, right? The idea that the war abroad and the war at home are linked is a key piece to the struggle, that we're not just talking about domestic immigration politics, if you will, or some policy platform. We're talking about global struggles for freedom. We're talking about these global interconnections that we're all talking about here. And these movements, you know, against the G20, against the Olympics, no Olympics on stolen native land, all of these struggles really centered this idea of a radical anti-capitalist, anti-colonial movement. And we saw the solidarities that emerged, especially where I'm based on unceded Coast Salish Territories, between various Indigenous struggles and migrant justice struggles, right? Delegations to land defenders struggles, you know, when the MV Sunsea, the boat of Tamil refugees, and prior to that, the Ocean Lady. So for folks who don't know, MV Sunsea and MV Ocean Lady were two large boats of Tamil refugees who arrived on the West Coast. Almost all of those who arrived were detained immediately upon arrival. So we're like, that's over 500 people, 476 plus 492 folks who are aboard. And, you know, every week we had demonstrations at the detention centers in front of them, noise demos every weekend. To just show our presence, right? That's the point of prison demonstrations, of demos outside prisons, and of course making links with prison justice and prison abolitionist movements, with migrant justice movements within the Tamil community. But in particular, almost every weekend, Indigenous land defenders were showing up to these noise demonstrations to assert that Tamil refugees were welcome, that the detention center was not Indigenous law. The Wet'suwet'en have repeatedly showed alliance and solidarity with migrant justice struggles in the province and the lands that I'm on. And there's so many other examples I know across these lands. And so those alliances, those responsibilities, those relationships have been crucial. And of course, you know, really during Idle No More became even more visible. But I want to emphasize that prior to that, they were just as strong, and if not stronger, because I think, you know, one of the things now in this reconciliation era is that it can be easy to do a land acknowledgement and not know and not have relationships. So the work of actually building relationships, of understanding what Indigenous laws are. Neski Manuel from the Secwepemc community spent a lot of time with migrant justice organizers telling us and teaching us and being in dialogue with us about what Indigenous laws on immigration would look like and what they have looked like and what that would mean to actually live in alliance and responsibility and under the jurisdiction of Indigenous laws, right? That's like deep, meaningful work that, again, in terms of lessons that we need to continue to commit to in terms of how we do this work. And then the last thing that I'll say, and which touches on direct actions, I just want to say how important direct action has been to this struggle. And I know everyone here knows this, but I want to emphasize this because this may seem like a policy moment, but it's direct actions like, you know, the May 2003 occupation in Vancouver. I actually wasn't living in Vancouver at the time, but was so inspired when I heard about this when I was still in Montreal. In January 2003, a group of 30 organizers, this is before, you know, there was a formal migrant justice group in Vancouver, people from anti-poverty work, from Palestinian solidarity organizing, from the Palestinian community, from people working with political prisoners, swarmed the deportation of an Iranian refugee and her son at the Vancouver airport, and actually ensured that they escaped from the airport. So they were de-arrested from immigration authorities and then escaped. Her son, Cobra's son, was later apprehended, and one person was later sentenced to 3 months in jail for his alleged role in the action. The occupation that we talked about in Ottawa. Throughout the mid-2000s, Majoub, Jabala, Al-Marai security certificate detainees repeatedly went on hunger strikes in Guantanamo North, right? That line, that kind of historical line to the detention centers, hunger strikes and actions that are happening right now and during the pandemic. And, you know, I just want to say how immense this was, because Hassan Al-Marai in particular in 2006 went on a juice and water hunger strike only for 156 days. It's almost half a year, while detained in Guantanamo North. And at that time, you know, they were speaking out specifically against the attempts to reform the security certificate process. And again, I want to emphasize this again, because the cycle of reform, you know, we have to distinguish between reformist reforms and non-reformist reforms. And they wrote an open letter when they were on this hunger strike during a debate about reform. And they said, quote, "We have been very patient and done our best to deal with a process where it is impossible to defend yourself. And we will remain patient because we know that ultimately we will be let out. But sometimes there's only so much human beings should be required to accept before they raise their voice in peaceful protest," end quote. And so again, you know, these kinds of actions where people took action against attempts to divide and conquer people are so crucial, because they remind us that it's possible. Not only that it's possible that when you fight, you win. If we don't fight, we have no chance of winning. If we fight, we have a chance of winning. And so those, I think, are some of the lessons. Lembar Singh is another one. I don't have the time to go into it. But, you know, in a direct action where thousands and thousands and thousands of elderly folks from the Punjabi, mostly Sikh community, surrounded Lembar Singh, who was about to be deported from Vancouver. And 2,000 to 3,000 people descended on the Vancouver International Airport to prevent his deportation. And that was a fight that many of us were told we would never win. We were told we wouldn't win because he was, you know, quote unquote, an undesirable migrant. Right? And we refused that. We said, no, those are the people we are going to center in our movements, because when they win, we win. And 3,000 people showed up to defend him. So there are so many of those kinds of lessons that I want us to remember, because one of the things that we know will happen, I don't think this is an if, it's just a matter of the details, is whatever, you know, Justin Trudeau is going to announce is going to be to the benefit of some and to the detriment of others. And in that moment, in that hard moment, is where we need to think about how we're going to move forward in the struggle. Thank you.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so much to unpack and dig deeper. I'm just reminded, you know, NAZILA, you were referring to this earlier, but, you know, there is, this is a common struggle, right? in the aftermath of the pandemic, I mean, the pandemic is still ongoing, but there is going to be the hammer of austerity is going to really come down. We're already seeing, right? There's the push to privatization that has also increased the temporariness in the immigration system itself, right? Temporary migration has really skyrocketed in Canada. So with this kind of, what we're seeing is big businesses, corporations, universities, colleges are all calling for more migrant workers, migrant students with fewer and limited rights in order to exploit us, keep wages down, deteriorate workers' rights. And at the same time, as Harsha was saying, they use racism and xenophobia to divide and distract us from who is really responsible and who is profiting. But what's amazing hearing you all speak is I'm organizing in a context where we have a platform like the Migrant Rights Network, which is essentially a consolidated force, right? And it sounds we're in a different context from the one that you are all in, and thinking about the kind of power of this, all these like direct action casework, all of the endurance of migrants ourselves to show up every weekend, right? To really take those risks is reminding me about, the importance of harnessing that power, of consolidating the force. And in that way, our movement is led by migrants, migrant and undocumented people. We're self-organizing. And I'm hearing so much about kind of, after, as Harsha said, we win regularization for every single person, we win status for all, that there is a single tier immigration system. We have to continue to fight for justice, dignity, but we need the power to do that, to defend ourselves, to have conversations with each other, have the capacity to debate. And so much of that comes down to being self-organized, self-governed, self-determined, and status for all is one mechanism for us to be able to even do that, to have the power to speak up. And so those are just crucial reminders. This not too long ago, our members in New Brunswick in a fisheries plant all came together and organized, marched on the boss to demand more hours of work, and had a full list of letters, which the boss conceded to because they were organized, and now they're being paid even though they for forcing their bosses to pay even when they aren't working. And so this is just the power of the ways that migrants, when we organize, we can win so many changes and really think through what's next. Just going back to the kind of like lessons here, listening to these two, Robyn, what are you reminded of over the last 20 years? I mean, just both attacks on and the resistance from the migrant movement, and especially with the rise of Trudeau and the deepening of liberalism.
Sure. So it's been so great to get just so much really inspiring, sort of movement histories of all the different ways that people have fought to win, and have, as Harsha, I think, reiterated so beautifully, just refused to leave others behind. I think that's something that's so crucial, particularly, as we enter this moment, I think with the demonstration that's happening on September 18th, with really this full frontal moment of really this insistence, right? That there's so many people along the way that have got us to here. So I was thinking of a few examples to highlight, I guess, what are different ways that we've seen movement respond to xenophobic attacks on our ability to stay here, as well as one example, I think, that just shows the way that sometimes movements can be shaped by just small, what we think of as sort of small encounters that can end up, transforming some of the conditions, in which we're organizing, in which we're thinking. So firstly, I wanted to speak about a bit of anti-racist and feminist struggle against rising xenophobia in the context of the Reasonable Accommodation Charter of Values in 2007. I think because we're in a context, if we're going to think about what status for all means in this context, we know that xenophobic responses to presence is real, right? That there are ongoing crises, right, about the presence of people, whether or not they were regularized or if they migrated here legally, these ongoing crises over how we the Canadian white settler nation state include them about the host nation in ways that totally, erase the reality of Indigenous land stewardship, and make the state the just and fair determiner of who can stay. So anyways, I think that these are issues that regardless of what happens at this particular moment, that we will continue to struggle against. So I thought just thinking a little bit of this one small, movement and organizing period in 2007 might just help. At least was helping me sort of jog my memory about what it means to be trying to organize collectively in the context of, extreme racist, sexist, xenophobia against migrants. So the Quebec-wide Bouchard-Taylor Commission was going to do its hearings in Montreal to bring together, people across society to air what kind of accommodations they thought were quote unquote reasonable to accommodate from different communities. Of course, there was a strong focus on Muslims and the veil and all of this, right? So known as Legal Montreal, along with Immigrant Workers Center, the South Asian Women Community Center, the Refusing Intolerance in Quebec, and many others came together, responding to this commission, and this, that was going to broadcast just different individuals' takes on what they believed would be just immigration policy. Right, I will remember to go slower. So as this had happened, this grassroots coalition was created in the fall of 2007. And by the end of November, there was hundreds that were mobilized to picket and flyer during the two hearings in Montreal in the Palais de Congrès on November 27th and 29th. Before the end of the first picket, there was, there was significant police repression. But there was also, many people had come together under the banner of what was called Accommodate This, that put together a counter report that held community workshops that would address and deepen and take migrants' accounts of the very racist and sexist realities of what it comes up, of what is sort of erased when we talk about who and what is to be included, like the ongoing exploitation of live-in caregivers, for example, right? So ended up putting together many public workshops, a counter report, workshops that I was a part of in Park Decks just for young people as well. So much as I think that, I guess this is sort of a small example of what it means to collectively counter-produce knowledge, is why I think it's valuable, because there was this intense moment of trying to say, we as a society are going to determine what is acceptable for those outsiders who will come here. But I think a wholesale rejection of that, and insistent that it's not the state that can tell us who does or does not belong, and instead really refocusing on a politic of belonging, on a politic of no borders, on a feminist and anti-racist insistence, again, that everyone has the right to move freely and resist displacement. So, I mean, I think the reason that I'm thinking about that so much today is that, firstly, it was powerful because it was collective, but at the same time, I think that we've even shifted in some instances further to the right, that this was at least kind of a sort of liberal inclusion model about how much should we tolerate, and it seems that the answer has perhaps been not much, right? If we look at some of the legislation that has passed more. So it's not the kind of memory, I guess, that I'm bringing back as a victory so much as something that shows the politics and the stakes of how we navigate against forces that are hostile toward migration in ways that are fundamentally racist and sexist and focused on policing women's bodies, Muslims, women's bodies in particular at that time. So NAZILA, you might have, I wonder if you'd want to add afterwards, because I feel you might be able to speak to the context of the present, but I just sort of wanted to bring that back. And I wish I couldn't find there's a very beautiful report poster that had been made at that time, and I couldn't find it when I was looking back through my files. But another reflection that I just wanted to bring back, reflecting to around 12 years ago, was thinking about how, again, movements change because of who shows up and when, and the ways in which, small encounters can sometimes transform movements in small and large ways. So in 2010, many of us, including I think some people who are here today on the Zoom, had organized a forum against police violence and impunity, organized by many known as legal members, SAB members, and other people that brought together, many movements, particularly migrant justice, drug users, sex workers, Filipino youth, Black youth. In particular, family members came together on a panel of people who'd lost loved ones to police and policing, including Bridget Tolley from Kitigan-Zibi and founder of Sisters in Spirit. And, you know, from this panel ended up co-founding an organization called Justice for Victims of Police Killings, right? That's family-based, many of whom were people who were migrants, were also coming up against the immigration justice system. So just to say that, you know, from this one gathering, you end up with a new formation that, of course, you know, organized marches and protests yearly on October 22nd to demand an end to police killings. And I think that there's something really particular in the history of migrant justice organizing in Montreal that has continually been oriented around supporting movements against police and policing, just because of, as I think all of us have highlighted, the real confluence of, you know, if you're somebody who's experiencing the violence of the border regime, you're also quite vulnerable to police policing and police violence, right? So that these aren't just sort of like theoretically interesting things that come together, but this is the fabric of people's everyday lives. And I know, NAZILA, you were part of the Justice for Anas Benes Coalition. You know, I was part of Project X and working against racial profiling in Montreal. So this is just sort of a place where some of the early constellations of abolitionist struggle came together, right? Of sex workers, Filipino workers, drug users, all coming together to come on these commonalities across terrains of struggle. And similarly, this is where part of a campaign against double punishment began, right? Because Lilian Madrid, who's the mother of Freddy Villanueva, who I'd spoken about earlier, a teenager killed by the police while playing dice in the park, and led to, of course, a really, you know, powerful street-based rebellion in Montreal Nord. Her younger son, Danny Villanueva, who had also been present when Freddy was killed, had served a sentence for a small infraction in 2006. But immediately after, Liliane had worked extremely hard with the support of Coalition contre la Répression et Abus Policière, you know, had worked to secure a public inquiry into the killing of her son. She very shortly after received a notice that her other son, her surviving son, Danny Villanueva, would be deported, right? Which, you know, herself and supporters have continually asserted was absolutely politically motivated as revenge for her speaking out, right? So again, you can see the way that policing and immigration quite literally come together as tools of repression. So the possible deportation of Danny Villanueva in the broader context of Freddy Villanueva's death brought to light the confluence between racial profiling, which of course is how Danny had been, that's how people get brought into the criminal justice system anyways, in neighborhoods with some of the highest Black, Latinx, North African populations in a city like Montreal, like Montreal Nord, Côte-des-Neiges, and DG, end up being a pathway to deportation, and once criminalized, being threatened with removal. So at that time, there was work between members of known as illegal, the Coalition contre la Répression et Abus Policière, the collectif opposé à brutalité policière and Montréal Nord République, to fight Danny's deportation, as well as to create a broader campaign against double punishment, right? To do popular education around double punishment and the practice, because there was so much fear and is so much fear, right? In communities around speaking out around the reality, because there's such a shame and a stigma attached to criminalization. So ending double punishment became one of the status for all demands of solidarity across borders in 2012. So this is an example, I think, of successful casework in that Danny Villanueva remains in Canada and important in terms of public education, but it's also a place where we didn't win the broader goal at this time, right? In fact, we can actually see that, you know, it's become beginning in the 1990s with a panic around so-called Jamaican crime, right? Where they really facilitated the deportation of people who were deemed criminals, that this is something that was only advanced more so throughout the 2010s, right? So I think this isn't to really highlight the tensions between individual casework and broader demands, but also just to look at how, you know, these smaller moments linked to broader demands, I guess, still put us in a forward trajectory where we're still facing the issue, right, of police collaborating with CBSA. Ending this is actually one of the demands put out by Black Lives Matter Toronto and other Black liberation groups in 2020, for example. So that was just sort of one example to give the history of what remains a really important issue. And I think that I'm going to share now the link of just a contemporary case that's really important for many people in our communities, of Aisha Ben Sleiman, who's a parent and widely beloved member of our community, who's part of many social justice causes and coordinator of the Jail Accountability Information Hotline, who's actually facing double punishment and deportation right now. So just to show that this really is still an ongoing issue. It's an issue that I think it's so hard to think about what it means to win, given the extreme sort of public refusal to acknowledge criminalization as not a moral category, the sort of refusal to acknowledgement that criminalization is a race, is an act of race making. So I just really want to share this important fundraiser for Aisha Ben Sleiman, who is really still trying to fight that deportation alongside many people in this Zoom. So if anybody here wants to be able to donate to this GoFundMe at this time. And, oh wow, 8:15. So that's all I'll say about that. Those are a few examples. Oh yeah, there's just one really short thing that I had wanted to say, which is just that under liberalism, Justin Trudeau came in 2015. After hunger strikes had happened in Ontario facilities, right, where what was the humanitarian thing that was supposed to come out of that ended up being $138 million to transform the immigration detention system in Canada, to supposedly make it humane, but that's actually about reconstructing new immigration holding facilities, including one in Laval that people are fighting right now. So I just want to shout out that campaign to stop the creation of the Laval Immigration Detention Center. And all I'd want to say is that despite liberalism and much of the rhetoric shifting from a less hostile words and wordsmithing, in the year 2019 to 2020, the CBSA carried out 11,444 removals. That was the highest number in the last 5 years, and 825 detentions, which is actually higher than the numbers at the tail end of the Harper years. So even if we look to rhetorical strategies and some policies, it's important to remember that there is still a kind of bipartisan commitment to the border regime in many ways that I don't think we should allow ourselves to be distracted from, even if there are moments of sort of more humane, more liberal, more tolerant possibilities.
Thank you, Robyn. My imagination is just full about all of the moments you've reminded us of, and of course, just plugging in Comrade Aisha's GoFundMe again. There's just so much when it comes to the moment that we're in and the kind of like future that we're thinking about. And so to end, let's talk about this particular moment that we're in right now. There is a minority liberal government. There is rising right-wing forces and extreme conservatism. There are rising prices and inflation. More people are food insecure. More migrants are food insecure. And, migrants, for example, many people may not know, this is another example of the way that we're punished and criminalized. If migrants get income supports, we become financially or inadmissible for permanent residency, right? So again, criminalization, punishment of poverty. But going back to the moment, we're also just, coming out of COVID. There is a hot war and a cold war. Given all of this, how should we move ahead strategically right now to win regularization? And also, what excites you, and what should we be wary of? Maybe NAZILA, we can start, we can pull you in here.
Thanks for that, Sarum, and thanks for the two of you for kind of tracing those connections and reminding us of the importance of remaining rooted in our struggles. For the sake of time, I don't want to take up too much time, but I'll maybe just kind of jump back on what Robyn and Harsha were sharing. In terms of maybe saying, there might appear, I don't think for people necessarily on this call, but there might appear to be a contradiction between, sort of abolitionist politics, radical politics, and, asking for status for all in the context of policy reform. But I hope it's clear for folks that, those are kind of mutually reinforcing rather than mutually exclusive. And Harsha talked about the distinction between non-reformist reform and reformist reform, but this idea that if we approach the work we do from an abolitionist perspective, then the border being ultimately what we want to abolish, then all the sort of issues, lessons around prison abolition apply as well, right? So there needs to be reform campaigns that make people's lives livable until abolition. There needs to be prefigurative, projects that build alternatives, right? And we didn't have a chance to get into that very much, but the whole idea of abolition feminism and, alternatives to the carceral systems and building models of restorative justice within our communities, building accountability within our communities, as for myself as a healthcare provider, building alternatives in terms of health provision, in terms of community care, in terms of mutual aid and support. All these things I think are integral to the kind of work, the idea of while we walk, we ask questions. So we build structures that carry forward and so that carry the memory, that carry infrastructure, that carry people forward, and the lessons and analysis while we continue to do this work. And so there needs to be sort of both happening at the same time. So I think it can't be understated the importance of a large-scale regularization program right now that leaves no one behind. As I think ROBYN and Harsha said very clearly, it means that people don't have to live in fear anymore. It means that people don't have to be exploited by their bosses, that they have access to healthcare, to school, to housing, to social services. That's huge, that's major, that brings back humanity in people's lives, and that's fundamental. But at the same time, as I think we've been saying, we need to keep centering a no borders analysis and a migrant justice analysis while doing this work. And I think that's the idea of kind of expanding and doing the day-to-day work. There's this line that stayed with me at the amazing Liberation Health Convergence that was organized by folks in Toronto a few years ago by Angela Robertson, where she says it's the idea of planting the garden alongside the fire. So it's the idea of doing the day-to-day work while we're continuing to build on these campaigns, on these movements, and creating connections. There's many things that we can talk about in terms of strategy in this moment and tactics, but I don't think we'll have time to get into it. But I think one thing that I do want to touch on is the idea of the importance of winning these victories in order to build and create momentum in our movements and build alliances and coalitions. And this is not liberal politics. I think this is radical politics, because while the current moment, as we've said, maybe appeals to liberal politics, the idea of things are so bad that, let's just close this one detention center, or let's just stop privatization of healthcare. The root of radical politics and abolitionist politics prevents us from falling into the trap of cooptation, I hope, and makes us continue to, fight for justice and liberation, and have demands that are really truly rooted in abolitionist politics. So I think this idea of constructive politics, as some people refer to it, so, when they say no immigration, we say status for all or no borders. When they say, wokes are taking over public discourse, we say land back. So it's, upping the ante and continuing to push for demands that are rooted in radical politics and this idea of interconnected movements like we talked about at the beginning of this conversation. So to me, those are some of the thoughts that I've been thinking about over the last few weeks, and thinking about this moment and what regularization would mean at this point in time.
Thank you, Harsha. Let's add in. These are such important lessons to know.
Thank you for these questions. And I just want to say what a joy it is to listen to NAZILA and ROBYN, and to listen and learn and think alongside. So I just want to extend my gratitude and respect. In terms of this moment, maybe I'll just pick up where NAZILA was in terms of how important status for all is. And in my view, and when status for all kind of emerged, I mean, it has a long trajectory, but, again, in this time frame that we're talking about, it really was a politics to make the border obsolete. Right? Like, what function do bordering regimes have if people actually have everything they need and the border becomes obsolete? And status for all is one way of getting to that. It's not the only way, but it is one way of making the border obsolete by saying that every single person who is living without status, irrespective of who they are, their humanity, the very fact that they are a human being, means that the border should not impact their lives, right? That the violence of the border is something that we all deserve to be free from. And that is the potential of a truly status for all program, which we know is not. So the lesson, of course, is that is what we have to fight for. We cannot accept, as I think we've all been saying, the idea that some people are deserving of status and other people are not, right? Like that is not something that we can accept in whatever kind of regularization program will be proposed. And also, you know, campaigns like Solidarity Cities that are imagining, again, how to make the border obsolete by ensuring that migrants and refugees and undocumented people and migrant workers and students, people with various kinds of precarious immigration status, are not left behind in the provision of public services, which are flawed and racist and limited. And also people deserve them, right? People deserve healthcare, people deserve to be in school. And, you know, that kind of, you know, making the border obsolete by ensuring that those of us who have those skills are welcoming people, irrespective of their immigration status, to our places of employment, you know, all the spaces that we work in, is also part of a status for all politics, because we also have the power to somewhat make the border obsolete in our everyday by keeping people safe, by fighting against their detention and deportation, by supporting detainees, by ensuring that no border guard is allowed in our place of work if, you know, we work at a community center or a hospital or a school, for example. I think also, I think in this moment, it's so important, you know, this kind of like, how do we respond to the right? I think if anything, the Trudeau era is a reminder that liberalism is not the counter to far-right fascism. It is the breeding ground for far-right fascism. So Trudeau's liberal refugees welcome, his liberal multiculturalism, his selective kind of, you know, Syrian and Ukrainian refugees only, the, you know, alternatives to detention, quote unquote, that came after the hunger strikes of Eden and the Lucia Vega Jimenez inquiry and inquest, you know, the kind of increase in temporary workers without full immigration status, like all of that, liberalism is the breeding ground for far-right fascism. And so our response, again, is a radical left politics, right? It's not to try, I strongly believe that in any of our movement organizing, we don't counter the far right by being afraid of the far right and therefore centering and diluting our politics. That will not win. It is immoral, it is unethical, and it unstrategic, and a moral, a moral loss, right? It will leave people behind. So centricism is not the counter. We have to offer our radical politics. And again, if we fight, we win. And the last thing I want to do is, you know, shout out some amazing work that's happening, you know, that really is showing us the way forward. Robyn and I mentioned the Keep Aisha home campaign, you know, NSN, the Naujawan Support Network, is really the spear, I would argue, of multiracial working class migrant struggle right now. The amazing work that they're doing against wage theft, that they're doing as migrants against their bosses. They're doing such incredible work. Justicia for migrant workers, Migrante, like all this incredible work that's going on. Is you know, what we can be inspired by in this moment, and really, you know, amongst so many other movements, are the ways in which we move forward, so that everyone has the freedom to stay and everyone has the freedom to move, and so that we are free of all kinds of immobilities and forms of criminalization and forms of unfreedom.
Freedom to stay, freedom to move, freedom to return. These words have continued to endure, and, you know, have given rise to what I want to believe is another, you know, section of the working class, you know, my, you know, peers who have rising militancy to counter the existing kind of liberal institutions and offer and build these alternatives. Robyn, you have the last word here.
So I'll try to keep it brief because I know we're wrapping up. It's been so incredible to share the space with all of you today. And there's so many people I know who are in attendance today, who are part of building these movements, who have been part of building these movements, and you know, who are going to show up on Sunday. So it's just really incredible to have gotten here to where we are because of, you know, the people like y'all who are with me today, and so many more who are not. So the last thing I would add is just to say, you know, one last time to reprise that status for all being mainstreamed as a demand, becoming a policy, is so incredibly powerful and is not a sign in and of itself of liberal co-optation. Of course, that's up to us collectively in terms of what we allow the government to do with such an idea, right? But I think that today has been a really powerful reminder that non-status people made this possible, that people in detention made this possible, that people fighting their deportations made this possible. So it's not doing justice to this enormous and collective effort spanning time and space not to acknowledge the very real radical underpinnings of this demand. It's a net win that we are where we are, and the idea seems mainstream, and yet it still needs mass support, right? It means people need to come out and show up on September 18th, because the lives of so many people living at this time under constant threat and precarity and inability to move within and across cities, inability to have access to labor and health rights, that this is something that is so important to show up for. I think the last thing I would want to pull from this is that it's important that this demand was deemed too radical, not long ago, 20 years ago, absolutely, right? That you would be laughed out of a room. That's certainly within the Liberal Party, right? So it needs to be a lesson to always, always, always push for the things that we are told are impossible, because liberalism always tells us to only advocate for small scale change because that's what's pragmatic. But we can actually see that something that was deemed literally preposterous is now something that's literally on the table right now, in terms of, we'll see how that plays out specifically, but nonetheless, it shows us that you can actually make this, at this point, to reprise the words of Mariame Kaba and Andrea Ritchie, who say about police defunding versus abolition, defund is the floor. Well, we can say status for all is the floor, right? That will continue to demand, that continues to be incredibly radical, but regularizing people who work and live here is a basic humane choice. But yes, we can continue to ask for an end to forced displacement. We can continue to understand that migration needs to happen within a context that centers land back and Indigenous jurisdiction over this space. We live in a context where Canada, home to the significant majority of the world's mining companies, a major hub of displacement globally, we can hold all of that into account, because if we aim, again, for the ceiling rather than the floor, then we can continue to make things that we have been told were impossible possible. So I think that, we shouldn't underestimate the forces that are going to come up against this, that come up against even the most modest of gains. We need to be prepared to fight to protect the gains that we have won, as well as for possible pushback that inevitably comes from the right wing, from the co-option, from the expansion, people who will tell us that it's a detention reform to put electronic monitoring bracelets on people, right? We need to push against that co-option from the middle left and the right, the appropriation of the struggle. But at the same time, I think we need to remember that the reason that we're all gathered here today was because so many people sacrificed so much for what they were told could never happen. And now we're on the cusp of really seeing this happen within our lifetime. Thank you again for having us, for hosting this conversation, and to everybody who's here today.
You have got us so inspired, NAZILA, HARSHA, ROBYN. ROBYN, what you said, yes, we're on the cusp, and I'm just very struck by what you said, that it's up to us, right? We are responsible for making sure that we continue to advance this as a radical and revolutionary struggle, that we're bringing more of us in. Hearing from all of you, I can see that the past has been amazing. It's also been hard, lots of important lessons that we've heard, and together we're building a future we want to live in, as well as the present, right? And it starts with the action this weekend on September 18th. We'll drop a link to sign up in the chat again. But ROBYN, HARSHA, NAZILA, thank you so much for your brilliance, your honesty about what it takes, and for making time to reflect today, and also to our interpreters. I want to, just reiterate what ROBYN said, that, it's migrant-led organizing that has really gotten us here. And even though we face so much in terms of state punishment and criminalization, we're willing and ready, more and more of us every day are willing and ready to take the risk. We're stepping out of the shadows, we're unafraid. And what I'm reminded of is this poem by June Jordan. It's called A Menace to My Enemies, but she says, in fact, instead of saying, she says, be afraid, right? To our enemies, right? Be afraid. She says, I will not walk politely on the pavements anymore. And so we're unafraid. We're going to win this, and we're going to win regularization status for all and continue to keep going. And so just I want to let everyone know, based on what we've all heard today, NAZILA taught, you ended with the importance of building alliances and coalitions. Absolutely. For the reflections the three of you have shared about the past 20 years has really shown us that what is, continually needed is unity, it's solidarity that's in struggle, and it's also consolidation, consolidating our power, but also consolidating our gains and also projecting a sense of continuity for the next 10 years, 20 years. And so for everybody who's joined us, thank you so much. I hope you've also walked away with so many lessons. I know I have. Whether you are a migrant or not, we have this common enemy that we want to become, we want them to become afraid of us. We have a common enemy. We share a fight against a privatization and austerity agenda, against increasing temporariness and precarity, against increasing policing and surveillance and immigration enforcement. And really, the solution is to build the power of workers, build our power directly. So we have to organize, build the infrastructure so that we win, so that our communities also stay permanently organized. And, it's can be very simple, right? What does that mean? If you're in a workplace, you start regularly meeting with your coworkers, right? Around the table, in the hallway. If you're not unionized, start a unionization drive, go to union meetings. If you're a student, meet with others at your school. If you're a member of any organization, join with others like you. And so let's do this. This Sunday on September 18th, we'll see you out on the streets, and we will continue to see each other to continue to fight for status for all. And so let's do this. Does anybody want to add anything before we wrap up for the night? Robyn, Harsha, NAZILA? No?
Just want to thank you, Saram, and thank everyone for organizing the event tonight. It was absolutely amazing and an honor to be sitting here with all of you and everyone who was in attendance as well. So we'll see you on the streets.
See you all on Sunday. And shout out to so many comrades who are on this call. I just saw how many of our fellow comrades are here. And so just so much love and respect to all of the folks who have built the struggle.
Thank you everyone for joining us. And we'll see you on the 18th, and we'll see you on the streets.